Hey, welcome back to the book log, everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. This is one of the few books where I feel like I actually know a lot of people in real life who have read it. I think it's required reading for some people in school, but also it makes sense. I think it has a sort of broad appeal. It's got the perfect balance of depth and theme and things to say, while also being extremely loose and readable and funny and approachable. I think that's why Kurt Vonnegut was such a success in general. Like, his books managed to seem both obvious and profound. Like, you've understood this incredible and fascinating worldview this whole time, and somebody has just finally written it down for you. Slaughterhouse-Five, in particular, proposes the idea that time does not pass chronologically. That's just an illusion of the human mind. Instead, all moments of time exist simultaneously and are there forever. I think it's easiest to start talking about this book from that premise, because this is how the protagonist, Billy Pilgrim, experiences time, and as a result, that is how the book is sort of structured. The reason that Billy Pilgrim experiences time this way is that one day he was abducted by aliens called the Tralfamadorians, and they taught him the true nature of time. Billy's entire life, from his relatively normal childhood to his time spent as a soldier and a prisoner of war in World War II, to his life after the war as an optometrist, as well as his time spent as a specimen in a Tralfamadorian zoo on an alien planet, is all told completely out of sequence, because Billy himself experiences them out of sequence. He is unstuck in time, as the book puts it often. So, like, he'll be a soldier hiding in the woods in Germany, only to close his eyes and reopen them on a road trip to the Grand Canyon with his family as a kid. And then the next morning he'll wake up in his optometrist's office as a middle-aged man, and then doze off to be back on the alien planet again. In the Tralfamadorian reality, time is a permanent and traversable dimension, just like space would be to a regular human. Both in front of you and behind you exist simultaneously, and so do the future and the past. Everything is predetermined. What happens has always happened and will always happen, and there's nothing anyone can do to change it. In fact, even the thought of changing it is a completely absurd notion to the Tralfamadorians. No one ever dies. There are just locations within time where one might happen to be dead at that moment, but you can always go back to the moments where they were around. Like, that's always accessible. As a result, the Tralfamadorians prefer to spend the majority of their time in the pleasant moments of their lives and just ignore the bad ones. I think this entire concept is just really cool. It's fun to think about. I think Kurt Vonnegut explains it in such an entertaining way. There's the famous line about how Tralfamadorians see stars as rarefied luminous spaghetti and human beings as millipedes with babies' legs on one end and old people's legs on the other. But I also love how this idea plays into the other main theme of this book, which is about the absurdity and cruelty of war. Billy was a prisoner of war in World War II and personally experienced and saw some pretty horrific things. For instance, there's a really intense sequence where he is on this overcrowded train for multiple days as he's being transported to a prisoner of war camp. There's so many people on the train that the prisoners are forced to stand up the whole time. They're starving, they're freezing, the train car is filled with human waste, and these conditions are described in such a visceral and heavy way. The book also very heavily features scenes from the firebombing of Dresden, which was a real historical event that Kurt Vonnegut witnessed firsthand in real life. The way that he describes the beauty and the humanity of the city, only to witness it like brutally decimated, to have to like walk through an incomprehensible amount of rubble, to have to burn caverns filled with corpses. It's just a toll that's difficult to conceptualize. But then the book will switch on a dime from some incredibly harrowing war scene like that to some absurd moment where Billy is answering interview questions in an alien zoo. Some of the contrasts are so jarring that they're just like funny. I think the non-chronological storytelling is probably tied to the trauma of war somehow. Like, it's never laid out explicitly in that way, but it's easy to read it as a comment on the disorienting and traumatic impact of war and how Billy is traveling through time as a coping mechanism. Like, he's trying to escape the darkest moments of his life into anything else, just like the Tralfamadorians suggest. This is clearly a very personal book to Kurt Vonnegut, and I love the way that so many true events and real people are woven into the story. Obviously, you have the opening and closing chapters of the book, which literally consist of Kurt Vonnegut himself doing some omniscient narrator metafiction and discussing the book he's currently writing, how it came to be, his ideas, his inspirations, like real life people and conversations and experiences that informed the direction he wanted to take it in. But he also wove himself into the story in more subtle ways. Several times throughout the book, he, like, as the narrator, would insert a quick remark about how, like, oh, this actually happened, or and I was actually there. Kurt Vonnegut, as a character, is never referenced directly and doesn't influence the plot in any way, but he will go out of his way to remind you as the reader that he was there in real life in the background, doing and experiencing and feeling a lot of the same things as Billy Pilgrim. I'm now going to transition this review into a book report and compare Slaughterhouse-Five with Catch-22 because I recently read that book for the first time, and I thought there were quite a few interesting parallels. Both books are semi-autobiographical novels about World War II, both heavily juxtapose the dark, grim reality of war with absurdist humor, and both stories are told completely out of chronological order. I think Catch-22 has a more intense juxtaposition between comedy and horror, like it's both darker and funnier, whereas Slaughterhouse-Five is more surreal and strange, kind of on both ends of the comedy tragedy spectrum. The chronology works a little bit differently as well. Like in Slaughterhouse-Five, Billy Pilgrim himself as a character is experiencing the events out of order, while in Catch-22 the strange sequencing is only noticeable to the reader. Catch-22 also seems to be more of a critique on the military and military bureaucracy versus Slaughterhouse-Five, which is more about like pointing out the absurdity and ridiculousness of war in general. I think both books are awesome. Kurt Vonnegut and Joseph Heller were friends in real life, and I don't know, just thought it was like an interesting coincidence that I just kind of so happened to read both these books in such a short span of time, and they have so much overlap in their themes and stuff. But yeah, overall, Slaughterhouse-Five is a phenomenal book. I think the hype around it and Kurt Vonnegut in general is justified. It's just so bizarre and funny and surreal, and the way that he's able to make a book about the horrors of war come off in that way is pretty amazing. There's definitely a sort of cynicism running through this story, but at the same time, Kurt Vonnegut conveys so much warmth and compassion for humanity. Even as he's satirizing the stupidity of war, he recognizes like the vulnerability and the shared suffering of these human beings who are caught up in it. There are a lot of surprisingly tender moments and fleeting little acts of kindness among these characters, and it's all written in such stark contrast to the cold, mechanical violence of the war that these people are participating in. The famous refrain, "So it goes," which is repeated after every mention of death, it's kind of like the perfect balance of resignation and empathy in this book. Death is inevitable, but it's also okay. Everything is inevitable. And in the Tralfamadorian sense, no one ever really goes anywhere. I read this book for the first time in high school, and I remember really enjoying it. And so I was curious reading it again if it would still hold up to me all these years later. And I am pleased to say that it absolutely does still hold up. Still a banger. I feel very comfortable giving this book a 10 out of 10.